What's up everybody, Landon here with LMR.com. Today I'll be discussing the importance of Steeda's camber plates and how they're going to benefit your 2015 to 2018 S550 Mustang. If you plan on lowering or you have already lowered your S550 Mustang and need additional camber adjustments, then these camber plates from Steeda are a must-have. Camber plates are needed to properly correct suspension geometry on lowered S550 Mustangs. Excessive negative camber will cause premature tire wear, resulting in more money spent later on down the road, and of course, will provide horrible handling characteristics. All of that nonsense is easily corrected with a set of camber plates from Steeda. These plates are made in America with the highest quality stainless steel for the ultimate in reliability and performance. Steeda's camber plates are ideal for any lowered street or track duty Mustang and are specifically designed for the S550 chassis and its front suspension system. Each plate will incorporate a nickel-plated bearing housing that is TIG welded and CNC machined with the exact tolerances. Teflon lined bearings will ensure proper bearing articulation, and all of this is fastened together with metric grade 10.9 hardware and nylock nuts. Now from the alignment perspective, each plate will provide an adjustment of -0.3 degrees to -2.8 degrees. No permanent modifications are required to your car, and these camber plates are designed to fit all 2015 to 2018 Mustangs. In the box will be 2 camber plate assemblies and new nylock nuts for those of you still running the factory struts. Before you begin the install, make sure to have on hand a set of spring compressors. If you don't have any, borrow some from a friend, or you could probably rent some from your local auto parts store. To begin the install, support the car via a lift or jack stands. Remove both front wheels. Remove the 2 15mm brake caliper to spindle retaining bolts. Set the caliper on the rear of the K-member. Remove the brake rotor and set it aside. Use a plastic pry tool to remove the 2 harness clips from the strut. To remove the sway bar end link from the strut, use a 17mm open end wrench on the end link stud and an 18mm deep socket on the nut. Once the nut is removed, position the end link out of your way. Support the lower control arm with the jack. Loosen and remove the 2 24mm strut to spindle retaining nuts. Flip these around and rethread them back onto the bolt. Ensure that the flange on the nut is even with the dog point on the bolt. Strike each bolt with a hammer until the bolt is free from the spindle. Leave these in place and then remove the strut shaft retaining nut with a 21mm socket. This method will allow the spring to be removed from the strut without the use of spring compressors. Carefully lower the jack until the spring is unloaded. Remove the strut to spindle hardware, followed by the strut and spring. On the strut tower, remove the 3 15mm upper strut mount retaining nuts. Be sure and hold the mount with one hand to keep it from falling on the ground. Go ahead and set this aside. Alright guys, now that I have everything out of the car, I have laid our strut mount and our Steeda camber plate up here on a workbench, and I'm going to explain to you what's going to carry over from your factory setup. The only thing you're going to need from the factory strut mount is the bearing assembly with the rubber isolator. What you're not going to need is obviously the factory upper strut mount or the factory strut shaft retaining nut pertaining to your Steeda camber plate. It's going to sit right on top of the bearing assembly with the lower isolator. In the box with the Steeda camber plate, you'll find 2 retaining nuts. These are going to be used if you're going back on with your factory strut, or you're using an aftermarket strut that has the same thread pattern on the strut shaft as the factory strut. Now, if you're running an aftermarket strut that is using its own proprietary nut, you'll want to use the nut that came with that particular strut when installing your Steeda camber plate. Now, of course, when installing the bearing assembly and Steeda camber plate back onto your strut, you will need a set of spring compressors at this time, and I'm going to show you how to install it. Compress the spring, position the strut into the spring, making sure the lower pigtail is aligned with the lower isolator. Make note of the spring mark on the upper isolator. Install it onto the spring and align it with the upper pigtail. Install the Steeda camber plate onto the bearing assembly and make sure it's fully seated. Now in our case, we're installing these camber plates along with Steeda's adjustable Pro Action strut, which requires the application of blue Loctite. If you're installing these camber plates back onto a factory strut, use the provided nylock nut. Apply some blue Loctite to the strut shaft threads. Position the lock washer over the shaft and then thread on the nut. Finger tighten the nut and then release the spring compressors just enough to establish some spring preload. You can go ahead and torque the nut to 70 pound-feet. Fully remove the strut and spring assembly from the spring compressors. Before installing the strut assembly back into the car, remove the nuts and washers from the camber plates. Ensure that the tapered point on the plate is facing toward the outside of the car. Position the strut assembly into the car. Place a washer over the stud, followed by a nylock nut. When tightening the 3 nuts, make sure the strut shaft is centered within the strut tower opening. You'll want to fully torque each 17mm nylock nut to 37 pound-feet. Position the spindle into the strut and align the hole openings. Install 2 new spline bolts through the strut and spindle. This hardware is torque to yield, so new hardware is strongly recommended. Thread on 2 new nuts and fully torque to 184 pound-feet. Position the end link into the strut and torque the 18mm retaining nut to 85 pound-feet. Reattach the 2 harness clips. Reinstall the brake rotor and use a lug nut to hold it in place. Reposition the brake caliper and torque the 2 15mm retaining bolts to 85 pound-feet. Be sure to remove the lug nut before reinstalling your wheels. Go ahead and repeat these same steps for the other side. After that, you want to double check your work, get the wheels back on the car, be sure and run the car down to your alignment shop, and then you're all finished. Now for us, we usually request a little bit more negative camber because our cars see several open track events throughout the year. So all in all here, fellas, I would highly recommend these Steeda camber plates to all S550 Mustang enthusiasts. To see more products from Steeda for your Mustang, be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. These Steeda camber plates are currently available from the Real Mustang Enthusiasts, LMR.com.